A Viscoplastopology analysis of the Siberian Internment. Irreversible human damage under prolonged forced labor, number 1492, VPT Sharp 053, January 4, 2026. Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Humanity. Preface. Yesterday, I watched a Japanese television episode about several survivors of the Siberian Internment. Their stories led me to reflect on a sharp contrast in how defeated people were treated after the same war had already ended. There were two different Japan-Russia wars, separated by about 40 years. The first was the Russo-Japanese War, which took place from 1904 to 1905. Japan fought Imperial Russia mainly over control of Manchuria and China and Korea. Japan won decisively. This victory shocked the Western world at the time, and marked Japan's rise as a modern military power. The second conflict occurred at the very end of World War II, in August 1945, as Japan was already on the brink of defeat in the Pacific region. Under overwhelming U.S. military pressure, the Soviet Union entered the war. On August 8, 1945, just days before Japan formally surrendered, Soviet forces invaded Manchuria. This invasion took place immediately, before the United States dropped its first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The timing is important. Japan had already been strategically defeated in the Pacific by the United States. The Soviet invasion did not turn the tide of the war, but it did determine who would control territory and people after the war ended. This episode is often called the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. In August 1945, when Soviet forces entered Manchuria, the Japanese Kwantung Army still officially listed about 700,000 soldiers on paper. After Japan's surrender, approximately 560,000, 80%, to 600,000, 86%, of Kwantung Army soldiers were captured by the Soviet Union. After Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, more than 1 million Japanese soldiers and civilian personnel stationed in Manchuria were taken into Soviet custody. Instead of being treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, they were classified as labor internees. They were transported to camps across Siberia, the Russian, Far East, and Central Asia. This episode later became known in Japan as the Siberian Internment. Between approximately 560,000 and 760,000 Japanese, including some civilians, were detained for extended periods. The objective was not only containment, but also labor extraction. These men were absorbed into the Russia's Gulag system, and assigned to heavy industrial and infrastructure work, including logging, coal mining, railroad construction, factory labor, and military facility rebuilding. Many were sent to remote regions with extreme climates, where winter temperatures often dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. In contrast, including Taiwan, the Chinese Nationalist Government repatriated approximately 1.9 to 2.1 million Japanese soldiers and civilians back to Japan between 1945 and 1947. Despite having suffered enormous losses during the war, China, not the Communist China, chose disarmament and return rather than prolonged detention or forced labor. Living conditions varied by camp and commander, but the overall environment was harsh. Food rations were limited, and often insufficient for the physical labor required. Clothing and shelter were inadequate for the climate. Medical care was minimal, and infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, dysentery, and pneumonia were common. Political education sessions were mandatory, with repeated exposure to Marxist-Leninist ideology. Work quotas were strict, and failure to meet them resulted in reduced food or severe punishment. Most Japanese government and academic studies conclude that approximately 55,000 to 60,000 Japanese internees died while in Soviet custody, corresponding to a mortality rate of roughly 8% to 10%. Deaths occurred primarily as a result of malnutrition, prolonged exposure, extreme exhaustion, and untreated illness, while in some cases, they were caused directly by acts of violence or punishment. Conditions gradually improved after 1953 following Stalin's death. But repatriation was slow and politically controlled. Large-scale returns occurred mainly between 1946 and 1949. By 1950, most survivors had been sent back to Japan, but several thousand remained. The final organized group of approximately 1,025 Japanese internees returned in December 1956, following normalization of Japan-Soviet diplomatic relations. When the men returned, Japan itself was devastated. Cities were destroyed, families displaced, and the economy fragile. Many returnees were physically weakened, prematurely aged, and chronically ill. Common long-term medical consequences included lung disease, musculoskeletal damage, digestive disorders, frostbite-related injuries, and early cardiovascular decline. Psychological suffering was widespread. Many survivors experienced insomnia, nightmares, emotional withdrawal, depression, irritability, and survivor guilt. At the time, there was little medical language or social framework to address these conditions. mental and emotional suffering was largely endured in silence. Reintegration into Japanese society was difficult. Initial sympathy faded quickly as national attention shifted to reconstruction. Employment opportunities were limited. Health problems were common, and quiet social stigma persisted. Some were suspected of communist influence, while others felt shame for surviving when comrades had died. For decades, government support was minimal, comprehensive compensation was delayed, and medical care was largely self-funded. Only from the 1970s onward did Japan begin formal recognition through memorials, survivor associations, modest pensions, and official acknowledgement of responsibility. Long-term studies and memoirs reveal consistent patterns. Life expectancy was shorter than the general male population. Chronic illness rates were higher. Many survivors developed strong discipline, frugality, and endurance habits. Many became deeply anti-war and distrustful of ideological extremism. Silence about personal experience was common. Today, the Siberian Internment is understood as a violation of human rights of international norms, though responsibility is complex. Soviet policy exploited labor, while Japan's wartime leadership left large numbers of soldiers stranded without clear post-surrender arrangements. Modern Japanese historiography treats the internment as a cautionary lesson about war, ideology, and the long shadow of state decisions. In one sentence, the Japan-Russia historical consensus can be summarized as follows. Japanese soldiers interned in Siberia were subjected to harsh forced labor under extreme conditions, survived with lasting physical and psychological damage. They returned to a society that required decades to fully recognize and support their suffering. And for most of them, that suffering became a lifelong endurance rather than a chapter that ever truly ended. What remains most striking to me in this historical contrast is not military success, territorial gain, or political positioning, but the human outcome that followed victory. Under the Chinese path, defeated people were quickly allowed to return home from 1945 to 1947, and begin rebuilding their lives, carrying loss and trauma, but still retaining family ties, personal identity, and the dignity of resuming ordinary existence. However, under the Russian path, they were absorbed into Russian forced labor camp system, separated from families, stripped of identity, and deprived of time itself, long after the war had already ended, extending suffering for nearly a decade beyond the battlefield from 1945 to 1956. These were not different kinds of people, nor were they shaped by different moral worth or human value. They were soldiers and civilians caught in the same historical moment, subjected to forces far beyond individual choice or control. The decisive difference lay not in who defeated them, but in how victory was exercised once the fighting had stopped, and whether power chose to end suffering or to prolong it. This is a serious subject of humanity. Definition and preparation of dataset for this analysis. Definition of strain. Strain represents the survivability of the prisoners and reflects the permanent damage they sustained, which cannot be fully recovered. In this study, strain is defined as excess deaths caused by internment relative to the number expected under normal conditions. Rising strain indicates accumulation of irreversible life loss. Once accumulated, strain persists even after stress is removed, demonstrating that the damage cannot be undone. Zero strain at T0 period of 1945 represents no lasting damage, while following higher strain reflects greater irreversible loss. Strain does not decrease after return. No strain at T0 indicates no permanent damage. The T0 values serve only as the initial condition of this analysis, and have no physical meaning. Simply put, stress is what hurts the system, while strain is the lasting scar. Definition of three stressors. In this study, stress represents external forces, applied to the prisoner population that drive irreversible damage, strain of survivability. Three stresses are used: duration, labor, and nutrition. Duration represents how long prisoners were exposed to internment conditions. It increases steadily from 1947 to 1953 and then plateaus. Duration is the strongest stress because damage accumulates over time, even when other conditions do not worsen. Labor represents the physical intensity of forced labor work. Labor stress rises quickly and remains high throughout the internment period. Because it stays nearly constant, labor acts as a continuous background load that amplifies the effect of prolonged exposure. Nutrition represents food insufficiency. Nutrition stress is high during the early and middle years and improves slightly after 1953. This partial improvement slows additional damage, but cannot reverse damage already accumulated. In simple terms, labor and nutrition define how harsh the conditions are, while duration determines how long irreversible damage accumulates. Based on this reasoning, duration was expected to be the strongest influential stress. Normalization factors. Duration is normalized so that 1.0 represents 1 year of internment. Labor and nutrition are normalized using a reference level of 2.5, representing sustained heavy labor and chronic food insufficiency. With these normalizations, duration becomes the dominant factor because it increases over time, while labor and nutrition remain largely constant. As a result, VPT energy accumulates primarily through prolonged exposure under fixed harsh conditions, which is both mathematically, physically, and historically consistent. Data sources and scope. Data sources used or suitable for this study from Japan, which include Japanese Ministry of Health post-war mortality follow-ups, Siberian Internment Survivor Association records, pension eligibility death records, epidemiological studies from the 1950s to 1980s, prefecture-level veteran mortality studies, camp classification archives and memoir-based condition categorization. Perfect coverage is not required. Population-level consistency is sufficient. Final guidance. This analysis avoids moral judgment and focuses on systemic irreversibility. The purpose is not to judge history, but to measure permanent damage. This is precisely the domain for which Viscoplastopology research model VPT was designed. VMT analysis, observations, and interpretation. This viscoplastic medicine theory, VMT, analysis models the Siberian internment as a prolonged external loading process, applied to a human population system. The purpose is to quantify irreversible damage accumulation rather than to assess intent, morality, or individual experience. The output variable is survival strain, defined as irreversible excess mortality. 3 input stressors are used: duration of internment, labor severity under extreme climate and environment, and nutritional deprivation. Each input stress is normalized to physiologically meaningful reference levels. Strain-stress relationship, diagram of survival strain, versus 3 stressors. The strain-stress diagram shows a clear, non-linear and hysteretic relationship between 3 stresses and the survival strain. Duration stress increases steadily with rising strain and encloses the largest area, accounting for about 51% of total VMT energy. The corresponding energy contributions from labor and nutrition are 25% and 24%, respectively. This confirms duration as the dominant driver of irreversible damage. Even after labor and nutrition stresses begin to decline, duration remains strongly correlated with increasing strain, indicating cumulative damage driven by time under load. The correlation between survival strain and duration is 100%. By comparison, the correlations between strain and labor is 71%, and between strain and nutrition is 62%. Labor and nutrition stresses peak earlier in the strain range and then decline as strain continues to rise. This divergence demonstrates a classic viscoplastic behavior. Once damage has accumulated, partial unloading of stress does not reverse strain. Instead, strain continues to increase due to prior structural damage. This pattern explains why mortality and chronic illness remained elevated after repatriation, despite minor improvements in working load and nutritional conditions in Japan. Time domain energy distribution, individual energy areas. The time domain diagram of individual energy areas reveals that damage accumulation is not uniform across time. All 3 energy components rise rapidly from 1947 to 1951, with a clear peak around T3, 1951. Duration-related energy dominates throughout, while labor and nutrition contribute equally strong during the entire phase. After 1951, the incremental energy contributions of all stressors decline, particularly for labor and nutrition. However, this decline reflects reduced incremental loading, not recovery. The system has already entered a viscoplastic regime, and accumulated damage persists. Cumulative VMT energy, irreversibility over time. The cumulative energy diagram shows that irreversible damage accumulates early and rapidly. Approximately 43% of total VMT energy is accumulated by 1949, and about 76% by 1951. By 1953, more than 93% of the total irreversible damage has already occurred. Only a small fraction of additional damage accumulates between 1953 and the final return in 1956. This temporal pattern demonstrates that most long-term survival damage was already fixed well before the end of internment. Later improvements in conditions reduced further harm, but could not reverse existing damage. Stress contribution ratios. The final VMT energy contribution ratios are: duration, 51%, labor, 25%, nutrition, 24%. Labor and nutrition together define the severity of stress, while duration determines how long that severity is applied. In VMT terms, intensity sets the stress level, but duration time controls VMT energy accumulation. This separation between stress magnitude and exposure duration is central to understanding irreversible outcomes of survivability. System-level observations from pathophysiology. From a pathophysiology systems perspective, the Siberian internment behaves like prolonged overload, applied to a constrained biomedical structure. Early exposure establishes damage pathways, mid-term exposure accelerates system failure, and late-stage unloading only slows further system deterioration without enabling recovery. In this sense, the fate of war prisoners parallels that of patients with long-term metabolic disorders, where sustained stress slowly weakens the body's ability to recover. In both cases, long exposure to harsh conditions leaves deep and lasting damage, so that even after the original stress is reduced or removed, the consequences continue to shape health outcomes and mortality risk. When I reflect on this parallel, I realize that it describes my own health condition with striking accuracy, and helps me understand why recovery is a long and incomplete process, rather than a simple return to the past. Both post-war humanity and personal health systems suffer irreversible damage due to prolonged stress, exposure, and recovery after stress removal is structurally limited rather than fully reversible. The attached figures at the end of this article collectively show that survival loss is governed, not by peak stress alone, but by sustained exposure over time. This explains why survivors experienced persistent health decline, both physical and psychological, long after return, despite improved living conditions back to their homeland of Japan. In summary, the VMT analysis demonstrates that the Siberian Internment produced irreversible population-level damage, dominated by duration of exposure, with labor and nutrition acting as critical but secondary amplifiers. The system crossed into a viscoplastic regime early, making later recovery structurally impossible. Topological data analysis, TDA, using the same time index dataset, topological data analysis, TDA, was applied to examine how survivability strain evolves geometrically, under three stresses: duration, N. 1, labor, N. 2, and nutrition, N. 3, across 6 discrete time points from 1945 to 1956. In this study, strain represents cumulative survivability loss. The three stress trajectories are mapped jointly with strain to reveal the system's geometric evolution, rather than statistical correlation alone. The TDA results show that the strain trajectory progresses along a single, one-directional path, with no loops, reversals, or reconnections. From 1945 to 1956, strain increases monotonically from 0.00 to 1.70. At no point does the system return to a lower strain region, even after partial unloading of individual stresses. This confirms irreversible deformation of the survivability state. Duration, N. 1, expands continuously from 0.0 to 3.5, and defines the dominant geometric axis of the system. Its steady extension across all time periods forms the main topological backbone that carries strain forward. This directly explains why duration contributes the largest VMT energy share, about 51%. Labor, N. 2, rises early to a normalized level of 1.0, and then remains flat across all later periods. In the geometric space, this creates a stable but non-expanding direction. Labor sustains damage accumulation but does not introduce new structural states, or alter the overall trajectory. Nutrition, N. 3, follows a similar early rise, then shows slight reduction after T4, from 1.00 to 0.88. This produces a small local contraction in stress space. However, the strain trajectory does not bend, loop, or reconnect as a result. The global topology remains unchanged. Taken together, the TDA results show that, once survivability advances into higher damage regions, later improvements in labor or nutrition cannot restore earlier system states. Time duration under stress dominates the geometric evolution of the system, while other two stresses modulate severity without changing direction. In this dataset, TDA confirms that survivability loss follows a one-way, geometric progression driven primarily by duration, fully consistent with the VMT energy findings. Conclusion from both TDA and VMT. VMT quantifies damage through viscoplastic stress strain, energy accumulation, and measures how much irreversible damage has occurred. TDA complements this by describing the geometric shape and data points, connectivity of the damage process. VMT answers the question, how much damage accumulated? TDA answers the question, whether the system can return to a prior state. In this study, VMT shows that duration contributes the largest energy share, while TDA shows that the damage pathway has no topological return route. Together, they confirm both quantitative severity and structural irreversibility. Epilogue. I hope this paper meets the standard of a serious systems analysis study, one that avoids moral overreach and political rhetoric. This restraint is intentional and important. The purpose of this work is to understand irreversible damage through structure, time, and accumulated stress, not to assign blame. Even though I have personal and somewhat biased opinions deep in my heart after all, I am also a human being. While writing and reviewing the historical records of the Siberian Internment, I could not remain emotionally detached. These Japanese soldiers were not abstract data points. They were ordinary men, much like you and me, who were caught in the machinery of political conflict far beyond their control. Many were young, many never returned home the same, and many never returned at all. They were treated not as individuals, but as animals, labor units, subjected to prolonged hardship under extreme conditions. Reading these accounts, I felt deep sorrow for their suffering. and for the quiet endurance that followed them long after release. Survival did not mean recovery. For many, the damage remained for life. Perhaps this is why, in my later years, I chose to dedicate myself to medical and psychological research, focused on human health and resilience. I have come to believe that the most lasting harm to human systems is rarely caused by a single catastrophic event. It is caused by sustained stress, endured silently, day after day, until recovery is no longer possible. This paper is not only about history or modeling. It is a reminder that behind every data point, every curve, every energy diagram, and every geometric trajectory, there are human lives. Understanding how damage accumulates is not just an academic exercise. It is a way to remember, to learn, and, perhaps, to prevent future suffering. This article exceeds 3,400 words, yet, I deliberately devoted 1/3 of it to narrative storytelling in the preface section, because, without human context, data alone becomes cold and incomplete. The remaining 2/3 consist of scientific analysis, examining survivability misery, driven by prolonged captivity, forced labor, and chronic malnutrition, using curves, trajectories, energy levels, geometric shapes, and data connectivity as analytical tools, rather than abstract mathematics. However, as I moved through each dataset and every segment of those curves, I did not see numbers or models alone. I felt the accumulated pain, exhaustion, hunger, fear, and slow erosion of dignity embedded within the data. In that sense, this is not merely a technical research paper, but a call rooted in humanity, asking future generations to remember this forgotten history and to recognize where unchecked power and dehumanization can lead. My hope is simple and urgent, that such suffering is never repeated upon any group of people, regardless of race, skin color, religion, or choice of political system. This is where my humanity and my scientific work meet naturally. I am not using data to distance myself from suffering. I am using data as another language to understand it. Disclaimer: I write this article not for fame, but to share what I have learned, so others can understand complex systems, prevent failure, and live better lives. This content is provided for educational reference only, and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this article freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights belong to the author. Gerald C.